In Kavala versus Turkey, the Grand Chamber of the European Court of Human Rights has ruled that Turkey has violated the European Convention on Human Rights by failing to implement a previous judgment by the court. That's what I'm going to talk about in today's video. The Grand Chamber of the European Court of Human Rights has held that Turkey violated its obligations under the European Convention on Human Rights by failing to implement the judgment in Kavala versus Turkey. In short, judgments of the European Court of Human Rights are binding on states that have ratified the European Convention on Human Rights. There is a body that monitors whether states actually implement the court's judgments. That is the Committee of Ministers of the Council of Europe. If the Committee of Ministers believes that states are not fulfilling the obligation to implement a judgment by the European Court of Human Rights, it can initiate proceedings before the European Court of Human Rights. The court then decides whether or not a judgment has been properly implemented. And such proceedings were at issue here. The European Court of Human Rights has issued a judgment in Kavala against Turkey in 2019. The Committee of Ministers was of the opinion that Turkey had not properly implemented the judgment. Turkey insisted that it had implemented the judgment. I would like to start by saying a few words about the background, about the judgment whose implementation was in question. That is helpful to understand the issue that the Grand Chamber of the Court has dealt with. In the media, at least the way I perceive it, it has always been presented as if Turkey had simply refused to implement the judgment and said, no, we will not implement it. But it was not quite that simple. So, the case before the Grand Chamber concerned the implementation of a judgment handed down by the court on the 10th of December 2019. That judgment was rendered following an application by Osman Kavala. Osman Kavala is a Turkish entrepreneur who advocates extensively for human rights in Turkey, for example by supporting non-governmental organizations. He was arrested in 2017 on suspicion of two crimes. One was in connection with the protests in Gezi Park. In 2013, demonstrations had taken place against a construction project in Gezi Park. These demonstrations led to clashes between the police and demonstrators, which in turn resulted in nationwide protests which were more generally about the relationship between the state and civil society, the state of democracy in Turkey, and so on. The second reason for the arrest was that Kavala was suspected to have been involved in the attempt to stage a coup which had taken place in Turkey in 2016. The prosecution accused Osman Kavala of being involved in these two events and investigated him for two offenses under the Turkish Penal Code, namely, once an attempt to overthrow the government by force and violence, and for an attempt to suspend the constitutional order. On these charges, he was remanded in custody in 2017, as I mentioned. After exhausting domestic legal remedies, he lodged an application with the European Court of Human Rights, in which he claimed that his pre-trial detention was unlawful. And the European Court of Human Rights found in December 2019 that the pre-trial detention was unlawful and violated Mr. Kavala's right to personal liberty under Article 5 of the European Convention. In the judgment, the European Court of Human Rights stated that there was no evidence of any links between Osman Kavala and the Gezi Park events or the attempted coup. The European Court of Human Rights ordered that Kavala be released from pre-trial detention. That judgment did not immediately become final. When a chamber of the European Court of Human Rights gives a judgment, that is 7 judges of the court, the parties to the proceedings have the possibility to request a referral of the case to the Grand Chamber. The Grand Chamber is comprised of 17 judges of the European Court of Human Rights and deals with cases that have a particular significance for the interpretation of the European Convention on Human Rights. Until the time limit for referral to the Grand Chamber has expired, or until a decision has been made on the request for referral, the judgment of the European Court of Human Rights does not become final. After the ruling by the European Court of Human Rights in December, a court in Istanbul ruled on 2 more occasions that Osman Kavala had to remain in pre-trial detention. In February 2020, however, the competent court in Istanbul acquitted him of the charge of attempting to overthrow the government by force. This judgment was not final. However, the Turkish court ordered Kavala to be released on bail. On the same day, Kavala was acquitted and was to be released. However, the Istanbul prosecutor's office issued a new arrest warrant. This time, the charge was that of attempting to suspend the constitutional order. As I said, there were investigations regarding 2 different charges. The public prosecutor's office had separated these proceedings. After the acquittal in one case, the prosecution used the other case to obtain a new arrest warrant. Kavala was then arrested, brought before a judge the next day, and the pre-trial detention was ordered. So he remained in custody. Kavala was then indicted again for attempting to overthrow the constitutional order for his alleged involvement in the attempted coup d'etat. In the meantime, the prosecution had also appealed the acquittal in the other trial, and the court now decided to reconnect the 2 proceedings. So now it was again about the incidents in Gezi Park and the incidents in the attempted coup in 2016. And it was again about both offenses, the attempt to override the constitutional order and the attempt to overthrow the government by force. In addition, the indictment was expanded and Kavala was now accused of military espionage. And on that charge, he continues to be in pre-trial detention. So that is the background. The judgment that the European Court of Human Rights had pronounced in December 2019 became final. After a judgment becomes final, the state against which the court has ruled are under an obligation to implement the judgment and to take it into account. The Committee of Ministers of the Council of Europe is responsible for monitoring enforcement of the European Court of Human Rights judgments. The court informs the Committee of Ministers of the judgment, and the Committee of Ministers then enters into a dialogue with the state against which the judgment was rendered. The state submits a report on what it has done to implement the judgment, and the Committee of Ministers then decides whether it considers the implementation to be sufficient or not. If not, it points that out to the state and asks for improvements. And the state has the opportunity to respond and also to say, from our point of view, we have done everything necessary for the following reasons. So the monitoring of the implementation of the judgment is basically a diplomatic process, a dialogue in which the state makes a good faith effort, or should make a good faith effort, to implement the judgment of the European Court of Human Rights in accordance with both its letter and its spirit, and in which the Committee of Ministers provides feedback until the issue is resolved. But if no agreement is reached on the necessary measures, the Committee of Ministers can refer the matter to the European Court of Human Rights. And the European Court of Human Rights then decides whether the judgment has been properly implemented. At the European Court of Human Rights, the Grand Chamber is dealing with this kind of cases. That is a panel of 17 judges that deals with particularly important and fundamental questions of the interpretation of the European Convention on Human Rights. This is exactly what happened in the Kavala case. The Committee of Ministers repeatedly pointed out to Turkey that it considered that Turkey had not implemented the judgment. The European Court of Human Rights had ordered that Kavala be released from detention, and he continued to be detained. Since this remained the case, despite repeated reminders from the Committee of Ministers, the Committee of Ministers applied to the European Court of Human Rights to decide whether the judgment had been implemented. Such an application to the European Court of Human Rights by the Committee of Ministers is possible under very circumscribed circumstances. In practice, it is very rare. So now the Grand Chamber of the European Court of Human Rights had to decide whether Turkey had properly implemented the judgment in the Kavala case. The Committee of Ministers said, no, the European Court of Human Rights has decided that Kavala must be released from detention, but he still is detained, so the judgment is not implemented. Turkey said, the judgment by the European Court of Human Rights only dealt with the detention based on the original arrest warrant. The judgment only concerned the arrest warrant for attempting to overthrow the government by force. But now Kavala is in custody on a different charge. The legal basis for the detention is a new warrant for military espionage and for attempting to overthrow the constitutional order. The European Court of Human Rights did not deal with these charges. Turkey also said that if Kavala wanted to defend himself against the detention which had been ordered on this basis, he must first go through the domestic legal process again and then file a new application with the European Court of Human Rights about the new detention on the new basis. Since he had not done that, Turkey said, the court may not deal with the issue. So the matter was not that the European Court of Human Rights said Kavala must be released from detention and Turkey simply said, no, we will not abide by that. The Grand Chamber of the European Court of Human Rights found that Turkey had breached its obligation to implement the judgment. It said that in the original judgment, the European Court of Human Rights had already dealt with the allegations against Kavala. In that judgment, it had stated that there is no evidence that Kavala was involved in the events in Gezi Park or in the attempted coup. It then held that the arrest of Kavala on these charges violated Article 5 of the European Convention on Human Rights. And by that, according to the Grand Chamber, the judgment established that Kavala cannot be detained on the basis of this alleged evidence, regardless of the legal charge or qualification to which it is attached. Therefore, from the court's point of view, no new application was necessary because the European Court of Human Rights had already decided on this specific issue. Therefore, the Grand Chamber of the European Court of Human Rights found that Turkey had violated its obligation to implement the judgment. That was today's video. I'm always happy to receive any questions or comments and of course about new subscribers. Hope to see you next time.